So picture this, 5 people, we'll call them A, B, C, D, and E, go out for dinner together. A and B are a monogamous couple. C is polyamorous and is dating both D and E. D and E are not dating each other. What do you call this? Is this a double date, a triple date, or something else? If you follow my Twitter, which is at Indigo's Findings by the way, you might recognize this scenario. You might have even been one of the lucky 17. When I posted the poll, I only thought of it as an amusing, interesting scenario, and I was curious to see if there was any consensus. It was when I saw that it was divisive, even in a small sample, and that a couple of people were even commenting their rationale, that I thought it might be interesting to actually explore. A little background, the word date took on the sense of appointment in the late 1800s and gained a directly romantic connotation shortly after. And double date, a term nearly as old as that meaning of date, traditionally describes a romantic outing of 2 couples. Triple date is not attested by any dictionaries, but standard human lexical tendencies build an easy bridge for extrapolating a triple from any double. So our little scenario, 1 unambiguous couple and 1 water molecule, what do we call it? Let me clarify from the outset that I don't think there's an objective right answer. It comes down to what logic you choose to apply. It might seem obvious to call it a double date because the people can be easily split into 2 groups. In this case, is the defining factor some kind of relationship unit where a couple is 1 unit and a person dating 2 people is 1 unit and 2 units add up to a double date? It might also be obvious to call it a triple date because the outing can be divided into 3 couples, A and B, C and D, C and E. So the factor here is the pair. Any 2 people going out together is 1 pair even if there's an overlap. One of my friends argued that it's double and a half or double 0.5 because there is an overlap. One person is involved in 2 dates, so they can't both count for full dates, right? If that brings us to 2.5, is that to say that CD and CE are both 3/4 of a date, or is it to say that one of them is only half a date? If so, how do you decide which pair suffers that penalty? Maybe we're still measuring pairs, but with an added clause that you subtract half from any pair that includes a member of a previously counted pair. I find that metric a little convoluted though, so I'd rather just remove it from the discussion. You can also end up at double and a half if you're just counting the people. This is maybe the most simplistic approach. By an old-fashioned reading of date and couple, 2 people makes a date, 4 makes a double date, 6 a triple date. So each person is worth half a date, 5 people makes 2.5. But I have to say, date and a half feels weird to me. What is half a date anyway? For me, it conjures an image of a 3rd wheel. Of course, we could always reduce the equation. After all, why say 1 plus x is 3 when you could just say x is 2? In other words, the answer to the initial question might be reliant on what we would call it if just C, D, and E went out together. By the relationship unit logic, that's a single date. By the pairs logic, that's a double date. By the individuals metric, that's a date and a half. Of course, you could say that this actually isn't the same question. You could say that the presence of the monogamous couple significantly changes what metrics are acceptable. But I think there's an even more interesting question here, which is, what if D and E were dating? What if CDE was a closed throuple and they all went out together? The relationship unit logic still calls that a single date, individuals still calls that date and a half, but the pairs metric will call this thruples night a triple date. And does that seem off? I've never really known anyone in a throuple, so I'd be curious to hear any insight on whether someone with that experience would be inclined to call this a triple date. So suppose we introduce another variation of pairs called closed pairs, where any group of any size where every member is dating one another counts as 1 pair, as long as there's no loose ends. Yes, I know we're stretching the definition of pair, don't worry about it. So the throuple is 1 date, while the water molecule is 2 dates. Returning to the original scenario, I would like to discuss another factor that some might bring up. Many poly people have a main partner, so suppose C and D are primary partners while E is C's quote-unquote secondary relationship. Does that change how we perceive the outing? Does the secondary relationship count for less? Do you want to be the one that says that to E? And by the same logic, while different people perceive their relationships differently, if two monogamous couples go out, should you start evaluating whether one pair takes their relationship more or less seriously to determine whether it actually counts as a double date? But suppose E also regards their relationship with C as secondary, and they have a primary relationship with a sixth person, F, who also comes along for this date. Pairs calls this a quadruple date, individuals calls this a triple date, relationship units calls it a double date, even though the so-called unit on the right is starting to look like a garden snake. So it seems like relationship units has a breaking point. We can keep expanding this LinkedIn network until the whole alphabet's in on it, but an outing of dozens can still be summed up as a double date. So if you go by the relationship units metric, what is the threshold where you say that treating C's group as a single date is no longer viable? In general, it's probably easiest to look at the 6-person situation and call it a triple date because you have 3 easily identifiable couples. It still sort of dismisses C and E's relationship though. To boil this situation down to 3 pairs, could C and E not also hold hands, kiss, split a milkshake? Are they not also on a date with each other? But then something feels strange about calling an outing of 6 people a quadruple date. Meanwhile, you might have noticed that for the sake of the thought experiment, I've been deliberately tiptoeing around something pretty significant, and that's the perspective of the actual participants. Because it's really easy to bring this clinical sort of logic when we're speaking in the abstract, but a date isn't something you can stick into a centrifuge. For A and B, it might be easy to call it a double date because from their perspective, there's my group and the other group, and D and E might see each other's dates with C as separate and call the whole thing a triple date. C might see it as I'm on one date with these 2 people and those 2 are on one date and also come to the double date conclusion. Or maybe C would say I'm on 2 dates, so this is a triple date, but language is at the end of the day descriptive. Perhaps our final metric is called perspective, and perhaps it tells us that the date is whatever the participants want to call it. Maybe a double date, maybe a triple date, maybe just a group outing. If people in a relationship spend time together, when does it count as a date? Is it a date when they go to the grocery store together? I mean, if they want to call it that, why not? But of course, if a romantic couple goes out for dinner and a movie and they're lovey-dovey the whole time, and then they tell you it wasn't a date, are you as a listener going to accept that? That's the thing, though language is descriptive, that doesn't mean that I can say I had a sandwich for lunch today and expect you to understand that I'm voicing a stance on import taxes. Well, maybe there's some hyper-specific situation where you would, but that's beside the point. It is possible to stretch a word past acceptability. I once read a study on semantic deviance that included some really good collocations like legislative onion. The mental images from that. What I'm saying is that there are ways to misapply any given word. Let me illustrate what I mean with an example that I'm definitely pulling right out of thin air. Suppose you say something I disagree with, and I respond to that by accusing you of gaslighting me. If you take issue with that, will you accept it if I defend my choice of words with, well, language is descriptive. The meanings of words evolve. Don't try to police my language. At this point, the question is, by calling you a gaslighter when you disagree with me, am I expressing a natural semantic shift, or am I using language that describes psychological abuse to suggest that your actions are more serious than they are, to imply that disagreeing with me is psychological abuse? Am I reflecting a change in what the word gaslight describes, or am I trying to imply that something falls under the existing meaning of gaslight? And maybe, if just enough people were to apply the word in that manner, we could see a large-scale shift in the dictionary definition. Maybe in a few centuries, the abuse tactic will be a blip in the etymological history of what will by then be a synonym for lying. So then there's the idea of linguistic determinism, where your understanding of the world is influenced by the language you use to process it. Possibly the most famous example of this is that the way you're taught to express colors affects your ability to parse them. A 2007 study found that a person whose first language is Russian, a language which treats light blue and dark blue as 2 separate colors, will have an easier time parsing between shades of blue. It's not just color though. Think how your understanding of humor, your sense of formality, and even concepts like home can be shaped by the subtleties of your first language. And it's often true that subtle aspects of wording can be very telling telling of a speaker's beliefs or opinions. And sometimes you earnestly misspeak, or your tone slides a little bit off and you end up saying the opposite of what you mean. But while your language says a lot about how you think, a lot of pushes to replace language have no rigor behind them. It's just a word game, like whatever's going on with folks, you know? By all means, say whatever you want to, use whichever words you feel like, but I just think that encouraging actual change and actually challenging your biases are a lot more worthwhile. Just my onion. I believe that language is one of the most complex tools humans have, and that's why I reject any understanding of it as prescriptive. I think that understanding the prescriptive pedantry can be a useful skill in many situations, and I admit I'm prone to poking some fun at overused commas, but we gotta remember that at the end of the day, language is one of the ways we sublimate ideas out of our heads. I think the only way to really think of language as prescriptive is if you take the idea of the social contract a little too literally. And you might be thinking, what the hell does any of this have to do with the double date thing? I'm so glad you asked. I think it's so easy to want to flawlessly package something into a single word, to be able to put everything into a neat category, but most words don't predate the things they describe. Words exist to express ideas and things, and perhaps it is the existence of words like date and double date that makes us want to look at this situation and find its name. But the name was invented to describe the situation. The name was not delivered by God's hands, nor was it unearthed from the cavern of vocabulary. But the existence of the word and the existence of the social phenomena of going on a date, these things prime your expectations. The entire point of polyamory is that it doesn't play by the rules of monogamy. You gotta remember that double date traditionally refers to two monogamous couples, almost certainly with a very heteronormative perspective. None of this is to say that we should stop calling anything a date or a double date or whatever. I think that'd be a useless, impractical, and frankly dumb thing to aspire to. But I do take interest in my own instinctual response to ask the initial question, my partially facetious will to figure out what this is, as though there is an answer to that, as though you could take a social interaction and map its genome. Words are our tools, right? They don't control us, we don't owe them our fealty, and that is why I don't think there's a right answer to the question. I'd call it a multi-date or a group date or something like that. And if you want to call it a double date or a triple date or whatever else, I'm fine with that. And even if I weren't, there's literally nothing I could do to stop you. I think that there are true things and false things in the world, but right now we're working in the minutiae of personal expression, a territory where true and false don't really hold water. So by all means, plead your case for calling this scenario any term you feel like, and I encourage you to. I'd love to see any other approaches that I didn't consider, but I'll see it not as a case for what's correct or incorrect, but as how you want to express it. Thanks for watching.